Whilst the Second World War was raging on, with the German army being pushed back, there were different underhand operations conducted by secret commandos to bring sabotage and issues for the Allied enemy. One of these missions, codenamed Greif, resulted in 3 men being dragged out to execution posts, stood in front of a concrete bunker. The men were tied to the execution stake, and they had blindfolds placed over their eyes, before the American Army firing squad was stood with their weapons raised, and they would then pull the trigger. During World War II, spies and commandos were dealt with ruthlessly by most armies, and Hitler would order his German forces to shoot commandos on the spot. But the US Army even executed a group of teenagers who had been spying on them. One of those young men shot on the firing range that day was a 23-year-old Manfred Pernass, a man who had for some time been involved in the German armed forces. Pernass was part of one of those groups of soldiers who had been captured for their involvement in Operation Greif, but what was his story, and what did he do that led to his execution, which was ruthlessly captured by photographers? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Manfred Franz Joachim Pernass was born on the 3rd of August 1921 in West Pomerania. His father had been involved in the armed forces, fighting for the Germans during the First World War, and after the conflict the family moved to Wusterhausen, and they allegedly lived on a square which was renamed Adolf Hitler Platz, after the Nazi dictator. In 1932, Manfred Pernass's father joined the Nazi Party, and he was very active in the local Nazi groups, and when he reached 18 years old, Manfred joined the Nazis himself, and he became a fully paid up member. The father and son continued to get involved in the Nazi groups, and they were members of the SA, the Stormtroopers, Hitler's brown shirts. Manfred Pernass was a member of the Hitler Youth also, and interestingly a document was found relating to his schooling, in which his father had written asking for him to be excused from education, as Manfred had been selected for being involved in the parades during the Nuremberg rallies. But as the Second World War broke out, Pernass joined up with the German armed forces, and he spent most of his time serving in naval intelligence. But then at some point he was recruited to get involved in espionage and commando operations behind enemy lines, and at the time following D-Day in the Second World War, things were becoming increasingly desperate for the Germans and the Nazis. Otto Skorzeny, the favoured commander of Hitler, who was involved in liberating Mussolini from his capture during the Gran Sasso raid, was approached by Hitler for further missions. Hitler informed Skorzeny about the planned Ardennes offensive, and he wanted Skorzeny to form a special operations group who would trick and confuse the American forces. Hitler claimed, "I want you to command a group of American and British troops and get them to cross the Meuse and seize one of the bridges. Not, my dear Skorzeny, real Americans or British. I want you to create special units wearing American and British uniforms. They will travel in captured Allied tanks. Think of the confusion you could cause. I envisage a whole string of false orders which will upset communications and attack morale." Skorzeny formed a special brigade of men known as Panzer Brigade 150, and they were to try and capture at least one of the bridges over the Meuse River, so they could be blown up. Hitler informed Skorzeny that he wanted the group to wear American uniforms, so they could confuse his enemy, and also give out false orders, disrupt communication, and also send soldiers different ways. This was a mission which Skorzeny knew could lead to his men being executed, as they would be in US uniforms, and that they could be deemed as spies. But the brigade was formed regardless, and Skorzeny only had 6 weeks to bring his new men into his unit for what became known as Operation Greif. He wanted 3,300 men for this, but he got nowhere near that amount, and he also received second-rate equipment and vehicles. They were given 2 Sherman tanks which were in very bad condition, and Skorzeny then had to use 5 German tanks, including Panthers, and cover them in US markings. He only had around 10 men who could speak good English too, and this would lead to further problems when his forces were meant to be directing American soldiers the wrong way. They tried their best to do what they could, and there were accounts of US forces being misled. They had been tasked to blow up bridges, ammunition dumps and fuel stores, carry out recon behind enemy lines, and also attack US soldiers and destroy communications. The operation did fail, and a number of men involved in Operation Greif were seized and arrested. It did confuse the Americans and put them on edge, but only 8 of the 44 German soldiers who wore US uniforms and who were sent through US lines returned, and these men who were captured were considered saboteurs and spies. Manfred Pernass was recruited to Operation Greif, and he was involved in the mission. He was one of those allegedly wearing American uniform, and on the 17th of December 1944 he was captured near to Weiler. His group had caused a huge amount of panic, and Pernass, along with Oberpfählich, Gunther Bieling, and Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt, they were seized by the Americans after they could not give the correct password to go through a checkpoint. This group had specifically spread rumours that Otto Skorzeny, the commando leader, was intending to seize and capture General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander. The work of Pernass and the 2 others had profound effects, as during their interrogations by the US officers, they gave over information that there was going to be the huge raid in Paris to capture Eisenhower, and this led to the US general actually being forced to leave the French capital, and he was practically held under house arrest in Versailles, within his headquarters for his own safety. The actions of Pernass and the other undercover German forces led to the Americans becoming increasingly suspicious of themselves, but following his interrogation, a military tribunal was gathered to try Pernass and the other 2. It was found that as he was wearing American uniform, that he was a spy, and this should be dealt like one, as he was also spreading lies and rumour as part of Operation Greif to disrupt the enemy forces. Then he should also have been put to death and executed for his crimes. The death sentence against Manfred Pernass was passed, and he was then briefly held inside of a prison within an American barracks at Henry Chapelle, ready for his execution. This was, let's remember, whilst the Second World War was still going on, and it was not an execution that came at the end of the Second World War, but whilst forces were fighting ruthlessly in the Ardennes region. On the 23rd of December 1944, Manfred Pernass was led out to an execution stake and post outside a concrete building within the US barracks where he had been held. The stakes had been placed in the ground, especially for these executions, and the 3 men, Pernass, Schmidt and Billing, were brought out one by one by the American military policemen, and they had their identities confirmed. Following this, they were then secured to the execution post. Pernass was the final one of the 3 tied to the stake, and they had their arms tied behind their backs and then their feet tied so they could not move on the execution post. Each 3 of the men stared briefly into the abyss, looking at the collection of US Army soldiers who were gathered a fair distance away from them with their rifles in their hands. A blindfold was then placed over the men's eyes, a thick black cloth, which prevented them from seeing what was coming, and then a priest gave a few final words and said a prayer before retreating, as did the American military policemen. The US officer in command of the firing squad then gave the order for his men, roughly around 10 to 12 American soldiers, to ready their weapons. They raised them up into the air and took aim, and then the command was given to fire into the targets. Manfred Pernass was instantly killed by the firing squad, and as the bullets had been shot into him, he was left slumped forward on the stake, the power of the shots having dislodged a rope securing him to the post. Manfred Pernass was one of a number of German spies and saboteurs who were executed following their capture during Operation Greif. In fact, there were 3 more shot that day by the American forces, and over the course of the next week, even more were executed. He was just 23 years old when he was executed, and Pernass had been involved in the Second World War from the very start, but he was approached to leave his position in naval intelligence to become a commando under the lead of Otto Skorzeny. Operation Greif did cause a significant degree of problems for the American forces, but the fate of Manfred Pernass was a brutal one, in which he was ruthlessly shot by an American firing squad for his crimes in the cold winter of 1944. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.